The view I could not stand. Los Angeles had always been home for me. My choice of Los Angeles had not been volitional. To me, staying in Los Angeles has always been the equivalent of having been born there, perhaps even more than that. My emotional attachment to it has always been total. My love for the city of Los Angeles has always been so intense, so much a part of me, that I have never had to voice it. I have never had to review it or renew it, ever. I had in Los Angeles my family of friends. They were to me part of my immediate milieu, meaning that I had accepted them totally, the way I had accepted the city. One of my friends made the statement once, half in fun, that all of us hated each other cordially. Doubtless, they could afford feelings like that themselves, for they had other emotional arrangements at their disposal, like parents and wives and husbands. I had only my friends in Los Angeles. For whatever reason, I was each one's confidant. Every one of them poured out to me their problems in vicissitudes. My friends were so close to me that I had never acknowledged their problems or tribulations as anything but normal. I could talk for hours to them about the very same things that horrified me in the psychiatrist and his tapes. Furthermore, I had never realized that every one of my friends was astoundingly similar to the psychiatrist and the professor of anthropology. I have never noticed how tense my friends were. All of them smoked compulsively, like the psychiatrist, but it had never been obvious to me because I smoked just as much myself and was just as tense. Their affection in speech was another thing that had never been apparent to me, although it was there. They always affected a twang of the Western United States, but they were very aware of what they were doing. Nor had I ever noticed their blatant innuendos about a sensuality that they were incapable of feeling, except intellectually. The real confrontation with myself began when I was faced with the dilemma of my friend Pete. He came to see me, all battered. He had a swollen mouth and a red and swollen left eye that had obviously been hit and was turning blue already. Before I had time to ask him what had happened to him, he blurted out that his wife, Patricia, had gone to a real estate brokers convention over the weekend in relation to her job, and that something terrible had happened to her. The way Pete looked, I thought that perhaps Patricia had been injured or even killed in an accident. "Is she all right?" I asked, genuinely concerned. "Of course she's all right," he barked. "She's a bitch and a whore. And nothing happens to bitch whores except that they get fucked, and they like it." Pete was rabid. He was shaking, nearly convulsing. His bushy curly hair was sticking out every which way. Usually he combed it carefully and slicked his natural curls into place. Now, he looked as wild as a Tasmanian devil. "Everything was normal until today," my friend continued. "Then, this morning, after I came out of the shower, she snapped the towel at my naked butt. And that's what made me aware of her shit. I knew instantly that she'd been fucking someone else." I was puzzled by his line of reasoning. I questioned him further. I asked him how snapping a towel could reveal anything of this sort to anybody. "It wouldn't reveal anything to assholes," he said with pure venom in his voice. "But I know Patricia, and on Thursday, before she went to the brokers' convention, she could not snap a towel. In fact, she has never been able to snap a towel in all the time we've been married. Somebody must have taught her to do it while they were naked. So I grabbed her by the throat and choked the truth out of her. Yes, she's fucking her boss. Pete said that he went to Patricia's office to have it out with her boss, but the man was heavily protected by bodyguards. They threw him out into the parking lot. He wanted to smash the windows of the office, throw rocks at them, but the bodyguards said that if he did that, he'd land in jail. Or even worse, he'd get a bullet in his head. Are they the ones who beat you up, Pete? I asked him. No, he said, dejected. I walked down the street and went into the sales office of a used car lot. I punched the first salesman who came to talk to me. The man was shocked, but he didn't get angry. He said, "Calm down, sir, calm down. There's room for negotiation." When I punched him again in the mouth, he got pissed off. He was a big guy, and he hit me in the mouth and the eye and knocked me out. When I came to my senses, Pete continued, I was lying on the couch in their office. I heard an ambulance approaching. I knew they were coming for me, so I got up and ran out. Then I came to see you. He began to weep uncontrollably. He got sick to his stomach. He was a mess. I called his wife, and in less than 10 minutes, she was in the apartment. She kneeled in front of Pete and swore that she loved only him, that everything else she did was pure imbecility, and that theirs was a love that was a matter of life or death. The others were nothing. She didn't even remember them. Both of them wept to their heart's content, and of course, they forgave each other. Patricia was wearing sunglasses to hide the hematoma by her right eye where Pete had hit her. Pete was left-handed. Both of them were oblivious to my presence, and when they left, they didn't even know I was there. They just walked out, leaving the door open, hugging each other. Life seemed to continue for me as it always had. My friends acted with me as they always did. We were, as usual, involved in going to parties or the movies or just simply chewing the fat or looking for restaurants where they offered all you can eat for the price of one meal. However, despite this pseudo-normality, a strange new factor seemed to have entered my life. As the subject who was experiencing it, it appeared to me that all of a sudden, I had become extremely narrow-minded. I had begun to judge my friends in the same way I had judged the psychiatrist and the professor of anthropology. Who was I, anyway, to set myself up in judgment of anyone else? I felt an immense sense of guilt. To judge my friends created a mood previously unknown to me. But what I considered to be even worse was that not only was I judging them, I was finding their problems and tribulations astoundingly banal. I was the same man. They were my same friends. I had heard their complaints and renditions of their situations hundreds of times. And I had even felt anything. And I hadn't ever felt anything except a deep identification with whatever I was listening to. My horror at discovering this new mood in myself was staggering. The aphorism that when it rains, it pours couldn't have been more true for me at that moment in my life. The total disintegration of my way of life came when my friend Rodrigo Cummings asked me to take him to the Burbank airport. From there, he was going to fly to New York. It was a very dramatic and desperate maneuver on his part. He considered it his damnation to be caught in Los Angeles. For the rest of his friends, it was a big joke. The fact that he had tried to drive across country to New York various times and every time he had tried to do it, his car had broken down. Once he had gone as far as Salt Lake City. Before his car collapsed, it needed a new motor. He had to junk it there. Most of the time, his car petered out in the suburbs of Los Angeles. "What happens to your cars, Rodrigo?" I asked him once, driven by truthful curiosity. "I don't know," he replied, with a veiled sense of guilt. And then, in a voice worthy of the professor of anthropology in his role of revivalist preacher, he said, "Perhaps it is because when I hit the road, I accelerate because I feel free. I usually open all my windows. I want the wind to blow on my face. I feel that I'm a kid in search of something new." It was obvious to me that his cars, which were always jalopies, were no longer capable of speeding, and he just simply burned their motors out. From Salt Lake City, Rodrigo had returned to Los Angeles, hitchhiking. Of course, he could have hitchhiked to New York, but it had never occurred to him. Rodrigo seemed to be afflicted by the same condition that afflicted me, an unconscious passion for Los Angeles, which he wanted to refuse at any cost. Another time, his car was in excellent mechanical condition. It could have been made the whole trip with ease, but Rodrigo was apparently not in any condition to leave Los Angeles. He drove as far as San Bernardino, where he went to see a movie, The 10 Commandments. This movie, for reasons known only to Rodrigo, created in him an unbeatable nostalgia for LA. He came back and wept, telling me how the fucking city of Los Angeles had built a fence around him that didn't let go. His wife was delighted that he hadn't gone, and his girlfriend, Melissa, was even more delighted. Although also chagrined because she had to give back the dictionaries that he had given her. His last desperate attempt to reach New York by plane was rendered even more dramatic because he borrowed money from his friends to pay for the ticket. He said that in this fashion, since he didn't intend to repay them, he was making sure that he wouldn't come back. He put his suitcases in the trunk of my car and headed with him for the Burbank airport. He remarked that the plane didn't leave until 7 o'clock. It was early afternoon, and we had plenty of time to go and see a movie. Besides, he wanted to take one last look at Hollywood Boulevard, the center of our lives and activities. We went to see an epic in Technicolor and Cinerama. It was a long, excruciating movie that seemed to rivet Rodrigo's attention. When we got out of the movie, it was already getting dark. I rushed to Burbank in the midst of heavy traffic. He demanded that we go on surface streets rather than the freeway, which was jammed at that hour. The plane was just leaving when we reached the airport. That was the final straw, meek and defeated. Rodrigo went to a cashier and presented his ticket to get his money back. The cashier wrote down his name and gave him a receipt and said that his money would be sent within 6 to 12 weeks from Tennessee, where the accounting offices of the airline were located. We drove back to the apartment building where we both lived. Since he hadn't said goodbye to anybody this time, for fear of losing face, nobody had ever noticed that he had tried to leave one more time. The only drawback was that he had sold his car. He asked me to drive him to his parents' house. because his dad was going to give him the money he had spent on the ticket. His father had always been, as far back as I could remember, the man who had bailed Rodrigo out of every problematic situation that he had ever gotten into. The father's slogan was, "Have no fear, Rodrigo Sr. is here." After he heard Rodrigo's request for a loan to pay his other loan, the father looked at my friend with the saddest expression that I had ever seen. He was having terrible financial difficulties himself. Putting his arm around his son's shoulders, he said, "I can't help you this time, my boy. Now you should have fear, because Rodrigo Sr. is no longer here." I wanted desperately to identify with my friend, to feel his drama, the way I always had, but I couldn't. I only focused on the father's statement. It sounded to me so final that it galvanized me. I sought Don Juan's company avidly. I left everything pending in Los Angeles and made a trip to Sonora. I told him about the strange mood that I had entered into with my friends, sobbing with remorse. I said to him that I had begun to judge them. "Don't get so worked up over nothing," Don Juan said calmly. "You already know that a whole era in your life is coming to an end. But an era doesn't really come to an end until the king dies." "What do you mean by that, Don Juan?" "You are the king, and you are just like your friends. That is the truth that makes you shake in your boots. One thing you can do is to accept it at a face value, which of course you can't do. The other thing you can do is to say, 'I am not like that. I am not like that,' and repeat to yourself that you are not like that. I promise you, however, that a moment will come when you will realize that you are like that." The Unavoidable Appointment. There was something that kept nagging at me in the back of my mind. I had to answer a most important letter I had received, and I had to do it at any cost. What had prevented me from doing it was a mixture of indolence and a deep desire to please. My anthropologist friend, who was responsible for my meeting Don Juan, had written me a letter a couple of months earlier. He wanted to know how I was doing in my studies of anthropology and urged me to pay him a visit. I composed 3 long letters. On rereading each of them, I found them so trite and obsequious that I tore them up. I couldn't express in them the depth of my gratitude, the depth of my feelings for him. I rationalized my delay in answering with a genuine resolve to go to see him and tell him personally what I was doing with Don Juan Matus. But I kept postponing my imminent trip because I wasn't sure what it was that I was doing with Don Juan. I wanted someday to show my friend real results. As it was, I had only vague sketches of possibilities, which, in his demanding eyes, wouldn't have been anthropological fieldwork anyway. One day I found out that he died. His death brought to me one of those dangerous silent depressions. I had no way to express what I felt, because what I was feeling was not fully formulated in my mind. It was a mixture of dejection, despondency, and abhorrence at myself for not having answered his letter, for not having gone to see him. I paid a visit to Don Juan soon after that. On arriving at his house, I sat down on one of the crates under his ramada and tried to search for words that would not sound banal, to express my sense of dejection over the death of my friend. For reasons incomprehensible to me, Don Juan knew the origin of my turmoil and the overt reason for my visit to him. "Yes," Don Juan said dryly. "I know that your friend, the anthropologist who guided you to meet me, has died. For whatever reasons, I knew exactly the moment he died. I saw it. His statements jolted me to my foundations. I saw it coming a long time ago. I even told you about it, but you disregarded what I said. I'm sure that you don't even remember it. I remembered every word he had said, but it had no meaning for me at the time he had said it. Don Juan had stated that an event deeply related to our meeting, but not part of it, was the fact that he had seen my anthropologist friend as a dying man. I saw death as an outside force already opening your friend, he had said to me. Every one of us has an energetic fissure, an energetic crack below the navel. That crack, which sorcerers call the gap, is closed when a man is in his prime. He had said that normally all that is discernible to the sorcerer's eye is a tenuous discoloration in the otherwise whitish glow of the luminous sphere. But when a man is close to dying, that gap becomes quite apparent. He had assured me that my friend's gap was wide open. What is the significance of all this, Don Juan? I had asked, perfunctorily. The significance is a deadly one, he had replied. The spirit was signaling me that something was coming to an end. I thought it was my life that was coming to an end, and I accepted it gracefully as I could. It dawned on me much, much later that it wasn't my life that was coming to an end, but my entire lineage. I didn't know what he was talking about. But how could I have taken all that seriously? As far as I was concerned, it was, at the time he said it, like everything else in my life. Just talk. Your friend himself told you, though not in so many words, that he was dying, Don Juan said. You acknowledged what he was saying the way you acknowledged what I said. But in both cases, you chose to bypass it. I had no comments to make. I was overwhelmed by what he was saying. I wanted to sink into the crate I was sitting on, to disappear, swallowed up by the earth. It's not your fault that you bypass things like this, he went on. It's youth. You have so many things to do, so many people around you. You are not alert. You never learned to be alert anyway. In the vein of defending the last bastion of myself, my idea that I was watchful, I pointed out to Don Juan that I had been in life and death situations that required my quick wit and vigilance. It wasn't that I lacked the capacity to be alert, but that I lacked the orientation for setting an appropriate list of priorities. Therefore, everything was either important or unimportant to me. To be alert doesn't mean to be watchful, Don Juan said. For sorcerers, to be alert means to be aware of the fabric of the everyday world that seems extraneous to the interaction of the moment. On the trip that you took with your friend before you met me, you noticed only the details that were obvious. You didn't notice how his death was absorbing him, and yet something in you knew it. I began to protest, to tell him that what he was saying wasn't true. "Don't hide yourself behind banalities," he said in an accusing tone. "Stand up. If only for the moment you are with me, assume responsibility for what you know. Don't get lost in the extraneous fabric of the world around you, extraneous to what's going on. If you hadn't been so concerned with yourself and your problems, you would have known that that was his last trip. You would have noticed that he was closing his accounts, seeing the people who helped him, saying goodbye to them." "Your anthropologist friend talked to me once," Don Juan went on. "I remembered him so clearly that I wasn't surprised at all when he brought you to me at that bus depot. I couldn't help him when he talked to me. He wasn't the man I was looking for. But I wished him well from my sorcerer's emptiness, from my sorcerer's silence. For this reason, I know that on his last trip, he was saying thank you to the people who counted in his life." I admitted to Don Juan that he was so very right, that there had been so many details that I had been aware of, but that they hadn't meant a thing to me at the time. Such as, for instance, my friend's ecstasy in watching the scenery around us. He would stop the car just to watch, for hours on end. The mountains in the distance, or the riverbed, or the desert. I discarded this as the idiotic sentimentality of a middle-aged man. I even made vague hints to him that perhaps he was drinking too much. He told me that in dire cases, a drink would allow a man a moment of peace and detachment. A moment long enough to savor something unrepeatable. That was, for a fact, the trip for his eyes only, Don Juan said. Sorcerers take such a trip, and in it, nothing counts except what their eyes can absorb. Your friend was unburdening himself of everything superfluous. I confessed to Don Juan that I had disregarded what he had said to me about my dying friend, because at an unknown level, I had known that it was true. Sorcerers never say things idly, he said. I am most careful about what I say to you or to anybody else. The difference between you and me is that I don't have any time at all, and I act accordingly. You, on the other hand, believe that you have all the time in the world, and you act accordingly. The end result of our individual behaviors is that I measure everything I do and say, and you don't. I conceded that he was right, but I assured him that whatever he was saying did not alleviate my turmoil or my sadness. I blurted out then, uncontrollably, every nuance of my confused feelings. I told him that I wasn't in search of advice. I wanted him to prescribe a sorcerer's way to end my anguish. I believed I was really interested in getting from him some natural relaxant, an organic Valium, and I said so to him. Don Juan shook his head in bewilderment. "You are too much," he said. "Next, you're going to ask for a sorcerer's medication to remove everything annoying from you, with no effort at all on your part. Just the effort of swallowing whatever is given. The more awful the taste, the better the results. That's your Western man's motto. You want results, one potion, and you're cured." Sorcerers face things in a different way, Don Juan continued. Since they don't have any time to spare, they give themselves fully to what's in front of them. Your turmoil is the result of your lack of sobriety. You didn't have the sobriety to thank your friend properly. That happens to every one of us. We never express what we feel, and when we want to. It's too late, because we have run out of time. It's not only your friend who ran out of time. You too ran out of it. You should have thanked him profusely in Arizona. He took the trouble to take you around, and whether you understand it or not, in the bus depot, he gave you his best shot. But the moment when you should have thanked him, you were angry with him. You were judging him. He was nasty to you, whatever. And then you postponed seeing him. In reality, what you did was to postpone thanking him. Now you're stuck with a ghost on your tail. You'll never be able to pay what you owe him. I understood the immensity of what he was saying. Never had I faced my actions in such a light. In fact, I had never thanked anyone ever. Don Juan pushed his barb even deeper. Your friend knew that he was dying, he said. He wrote you one final letter to find out about your doings. Perhaps unbeknownst to him or to you, you were his last thought. The weight of Don Juan's words was too much for my shoulders. I collapsed. I felt that I had to lie down. My head was spinning. I made the terrible mistake of arriving at Don Juan's house in the late afternoon. The setting sun seemed astoundingly golden, and the reflections on the bare mountains to the east of Don Juan's house were gold and purple. The sky didn't have a speck of a cloud. Nothing seemed to move. It was as if the whole world were hiding, but its presence was overpowering. The quietness of the Sonoran desert was like a dagger. It went to the marrow of my bones. I wanted to leave, to get in my car and drive away. I wanted to be in the city, get lost in its noise. You are having a taste of infinity, Don Juan said, with grave finality. I know it because I have been in your shoes. You want to run away, to plunge into something human, warm, contradictory, stupid. Who cares? You want to forget the death of your friend, but infinity won't let you. His voice mellowed. It has gripped you in its merciless clutches. What can I do now, Don Juan? I asked. The only thing you can do, Don Juan said, is to keep the memory of your friend fresh, to keep it alive for the rest of your life, and perhaps even beyond. Sorcerers express in this fashion the thanks that they can no longer voice. You may think it is a silly way, but that's the best sorcerers can do. It was my own sadness, doubtless, which made me believe that the ebullient Don Juan was as sad as I was. I discarded the thought immediately. That couldn't be possible. Sadness for sorcerers is not personal, Don Juan said, again erupting into my thoughts. It is not quite sadness. It's a wave of energy that comes from the depths of the cosmos and hits sorcerers when they are receptive, when they are like radios, capable of catching radio waves. The sorcerers of olden times, who gave us the entire format of sorcery, believed that there is sadness in the universe as a force, a condition, like light, like intent, and that this perennial force acts especially on sorcerers because they no longer have any defensive shields. They cannot hide behind their friends or their studies. They cannot hide behind love or hatred or happiness or misery. They can't hide behind anything. The condition of sorcerers, Don Juan went on, is that sadness for them is abstract. It doesn't come from coveting or lacking something, or from self-importance. It doesn't come from me. It comes from infinity. The sadness you feel for not thanking your friend is already leaning in that direction. My teacher, the Nahual Julian, he went on, was a fabulous actor. He actually worked professionally in the theater. He had a favorite story that he used to tell in his theater sessions. He used to push me into terrible outbursts of anguish with it. He said that it was a story for warriors who had everything and yet felt the sting of the universal sadness. I always thought he was telling it for me, personally. Don Juan then paraphrased his teacher, telling me that the story referred to a man suffering from profound melancholy. He went to see the best doctors of his day, and every one of those doctors failed to help him. He finally came to the office of a leading doctor, a healer of the soul. The doctor suggested to his patient that perhaps he could find solace and the end of his melancholy in love. The man responded that love was no problem for him and that he was loved perhaps like no one else in the world. The doctor's next suggestion was that maybe the patient should undertake a voyage and see other parts of the world. The man responded that, without exaggeration, he had been in every corner of the world. The doctor recommended hobbies like the arts, sports, etc. The man responded to every one of his recommendations in the same terms. He had done that and had no relief. The doctor suspected that the man was possibly an incurable liar. He couldn't have done all those things as he claimed. But being a good healer, the doctor had a final insight. Ah, he exclaimed. I have the perfect solution for you, sir. You must attend a performance of the greatest comedian of our day. He would delight you to the point where you will forget every twist of your melancholy. You must attend a performance of the great Garrick. Don Juan said that the man looked at the doctor with the saddest look you can imagine and said, Doctor, if that's your recommendation, I'm a lost man. I have no cure. I am the great Garrick. The breaking point. Don Juan defined inner silence as a peculiar state of being in which thoughts were canceled out, and one could function from a level other than that of daily awareness. He stressed that inner silence meant the suspension of the internal dialogue, the perennial companion of thoughts, and was therefore a state of profound quietude. The old sorcerers, Don Juan said, called it inner silence because it is a state in which perception doesn't depend on the senses. What is at work during inner silence is another faculty that man has. That faculty that makes him a magical being, the very faculty that has been curtailed, not by man himself, but by some extraneous influence. What is this extraneous influence that curtails the magic faculty of man? I asked. That is the topic for a future explanation, Don Juan replied. Not the subject of our present discussion, even though it is indeed the most serious aspect of the sorcery of the shamans of ancient Mexico. Inner silence, he continued, is the stand from which everything stems in sorcery. In other words, everything we do leads to that stand, which, like everything else in the world of sorcerers, doesn't reveal itself unless something gigantic shakes us. Don Juan said that the sorcerers of ancient Mexico devised endless ways to shake themselves or other sorcery practitioners at their foundations in order to reach that coveted state of inner silence. They considered the most far-fetched acts, which may seem totally unrelated to the pursuit of inner silence, such as, for instance, jumping into waterfalls or spending nights hanging upside down from the top branch of a tree, to be the key points that brought it into being. Following the rationales of the sorcerers of ancient Mexico, Don Juan stated categorically that inner silence was accrued, accumulated. In my case, he struggled to guide me to construct a core of inner silence in myself, and then add to it, second by second, on every occasion I practiced it. He explained that the sorcerers of ancient Mexico discovered that each individual had a different threshold of inner silence in terms of time, meaning that inner silence must be kept by each one of us for the length of time of our specific threshold before it can work. What did those sorcerers consider the sign that inner silence is working, Don Juan? I asked. Inner silence works from the moment you begin to accrue it, he replied. What the old sorcerers were after was the final, dramatic end result of reaching that individual threshold of silence. Some very talented practitioners need only a few minutes of silence to reach that coveted goal. Others, less talented, need long periods of silence, perhaps more than an hour of complete quietude, before they reach the desired result. The desired result is what the old sorcerers called stopping the world. The moment when everything around us ceases to be what it always been. This is the moment when sorcerers return to the true nature of man. Don Juan went on. The old sorcerers called it total freedom. It is the moment when the man, the slave, becomes the man, free being, capable of feats of perception that defy our linear imagination. Don Juan assured me that inner silence is the avenue that leads to a true suspension of judgment, to a moment when sensory data emanating from the universe at large ceases to be interpreted by the senses. A moment when cognition ceases to be the force which through usage and repetition decides the nature of the world. Sorcerers need a breaking point for the workings of inner silence to set in, Don Juan said. The breaking point is like the mortar that a mason puts between bricks. It's only when the mortar hardens that the loose bricks become a structure. From the beginning of our association, Don Juan had drilled into me the value, the necessity of inner silence. I did my best to follow his suggestions by accumulating inner silence, second by second. I had no means to measure the effect of this accumulation, nor did I have any means to judge whether or not I had reached any threshold. I simply aimed doggedly at accruing it, not just to please Don Juan, but because the act of accumulating it had become a challenge in itself. One day, Don Juan and I were taking a leisurely stroll in the main plaza of Hermosillo. It was the early afternoon of a cloudy day. The heat was dry and actually very pleasant. There were lots of people walking around. There were stores around the plaza. I had been to Hermosillo many times, and yet I had never noticed the stores. I knew that they were there, but their presence was not something I had been consciously aware of. I couldn't have made a map of that plaza if my life depended on it. That day, as I walked with Don Juan, I was trying to locate and identify the stores. I searched for something to use as a mnemonic device that would stir my recollection for later use. As I have told you before many times, Don Juan said, jolting me out of my concentration, every sorcerer I know, male or female, sooner or later arrives at a breaking point in their lives. Do you mean that they have a mental breakdown or something like that? I asked. No, he said, laughing. Mental breakdowns are for persons who indulge in themselves. Sorcerers are not persons. What I mean is that at a given moment, the continuity of their lives has to break in order for inner silence to set in and become an active part of their structures. It's very, very important, Don Juan went on, that you yourself deliberately arrive at that breaking point, or that you create it artificially and intelligently. What do you mean by that, Don Juan? I asked, caught in his intriguing reasoning. Your breaking point, he said, is to discontinue your life as you know it. You have done everything I told you, dutifully and accurately. If you are talented, you never show it. That seems to be your style. You're not slow, but you act as if you were. You're very sure of yourself, but you act as if you were insecure. You're not timid, and yet you act as if you are afraid of people. Everything you do points at one single spot: your need to break all that ruthlessly. But in what way, Don Juan? What do you have in mind? I asked, genuinely frantic. I think everything boils down to one act, he said. You must leave your friends. You must say goodbye to them for good. It's not possible for you to continue on the warrior's path, carrying your personal history with you. And unless you discontinue your way of life, I won't be able to go ahead with my instruction. Now, Don Juan, I said, I have to put my foot down. You're asking too much of me. To be frank with you, I don't think I can do it. My friends are my family, my points of reference. Precisely, he remarked. They are your points of reference. Therefore, they have to go. Sorcerers have only one point of reference: infinity. But how do you want me to proceed, Don Juan? I asked in a plaintive voice. His request was driving me up the wall. You must simply leave, he said, matter-of-factly. Leave any way you can. But where would I go? I asked. My recommendation is that you rent a room in one of those chintzy hotels you know, he said. The uglier the place, the better. If the room has drab green carpet and drab green drapes and drab green walls, so much the better. A place comparable to that hotel I showed you once in Los Angeles. I laughed nervously at my recollection of a time when I was driving with Don Juan through the industrial side of Los Angeles, where there were only warehouses and dilapidated hotels for transients. One hotel in particular attracted Don Juan's attention because of its bombastic name, Edward VII. We stopped across the street from it for a moment to look at it. That hotel over there, Don Juan said, pointing at it, is to me the true representation of life on earth for the average person. If you are lucky or ruthless, you will get a room with a view of the street, where you will see this endless parade of human misery. If you're not that lucky or that ruthless, you will get a room on the inside with windows to the wall of the next building. Think of spending a lifetime torn between those two views, envying the view of the street if you're inside, and envying the view of the wall if you're on the outside, tired of looking out. Don Juan's metaphor bothered me no end, for I had taken it all in. Now, faced with the possibility of having to rent a room in a hotel comparable to the Edward VII, I didn't know what to say or which way to go. What do you want me to do there, Don Juan? I asked. A sorcerer uses a place like that to die, he said, looking at me with an unblinking stare. You have never been alone in your life. This is the time to do it. You will stay in that room until you die. His request scared me, but at the same time, it made me laugh. Not that I'm going to do it, Don Juan, I said. But what would be the criteria to know that I am dead? Unless you want me to actually die physically. No, he said, I don't want your body to die physically. I want your person to die. The two are very different affairs. In essence, your person has very little to do with your body. Your person is your mind. And believe you me, your mind is not yours. What is this nonsense, Don Juan, that my mind is not mine? I heard myself asking with a nervous twang in my voice. I'll tell you about the subject someday, he said, but not while you're cushioned by your friends. The criteria that indicates that a sorcerer is dead, he went on, is when it makes no difference to him whether he has company or whether he is alone. The day you don't covet the company of your friends, whom you use as shields, that's the day that your person has died. What do you say? Are you game? I can't do it, Don Juan, I said. It's useless that I try to lie to you. I can't leave my friends. It's perfectly all right, he said, unperturbed. My statement didn't seem to affect him in the least. I won't be able to talk to you anymore. But let's say that during our time together, you have learned a great deal. You have learned things that will make you very strong, regardless of whether you come back or you stay away. He patted me on the back and said goodbye to me. He turned around and simply disappeared among the people in the plaza, as if he had merged with them. For an instant, I had the strange sensation that the people in the plaza were like a curtain that he had opened and then disappeared behind. The end had come, as did everything else in Don Juan's world, swiftly and unpredictably. Suddenly, it was on me. I was in the throes of it, and I didn't even know how I had gotten into it. I should have been crushed, yet I wasn't. I don't know why I was elated. I marveled at the faculty with which everything had ended. Don Juan was indeed an elegant being. There were no recriminations or anger or anything of that sort at all. I got in my car and drove, as happy as a lark. I was ebullient. How extraordinary that everything had ended so swiftly, I thought, so painlessly. My trip home was uneventful. In Los Angeles, being in my familiar surroundings, I noticed that I had derived an enormous amount of energy from my last exchange with Don Juan. I was actually very happy, very relaxed, and I resumed what I considered to be my normal life with renewed zest. All my tribulations with my friends and my realizations about them, everything that I had said to Don Juan in reference to this, were thoroughly forgotten. It was as if something had erased all that from my mind. I marveled a couple of times at the facility I had in forgetting something that had been so meaningful, and in forgetting it so thoroughly. Everything was as expected. There was one single inconsistency in the otherwise near paradigm of my new, old life. I distinctly remember Don Juan saying to me that my departing from the sorcerer's world was purely academic, and that I would be back. I had remembered and written down every word of our exchange. According to my normal linear reasoning and memory, Don Juan had never made those statements. How could I remember things that had never taken place? I pondered uselessly. My pseudo-recollection was strange enough to make a case for it. But then I decided that there was no point to it. As far as I was concerned, I was out of Don Juan's milieu. Following Don Juan's suggestion in reference to my behavior with those who had favored me in any way, I had come to an earth-shaking decision for me, that of honoring and saying thank you to my friends before it was too late. One case in point was my friend Rodrigo Cummings. One incident involving my friend Rodrigo, however, toppled my new paradigm and sent it tumbling down to its total destruction. My attitude toward him changed radically when I vanquished my competitiveness with him. I found out that it was the easiest thing in the world for me to project 100% into whatever Rodrigo did. In fact, I was exactly like him, but I didn't know it until I stopped competing with him. Then the truth emerged for me with maddening vividness. One of Rodrigo's foremost wishes was to finish college. Every semester, he registered for school and took as many courses as was permitted. Then, as the semester progressed, he dropped them one by one. Sometimes he would withdraw from school altogether. At other times, he would keep one 3-unit course all the way through to the bitter end. During his last semester, he kept a course in sociology because he liked it. The final exam was approaching. He told me that he had 3 weeks to study, to read the textbook for the course. He thought that was an exorbitant amount of time to read merely 600 pages. He considered himself something of a speed reader with a high level of retention. In his opinion, he had a nearly 100% photographic memory. He thought he had a great deal of time before the exam, so he asked me if I would help him recondition his car for his paper route. He wanted to take the right door off in order to throw the paper through that opening with his right hand instead of over the roof with his left. I pointed out to him that he was left-handed, to which he retorted that among his many abilities, which none of his friends noticed, was that of being ambidextrous. He was right about that. I had never noticed it myself. After I helped him to take the door off, he decided to rip out the roof lining, which was badly torn. He said that his car was in optimum mechanical condition, and he would take it to Tijuana, Mexico, which, as a good Angelino of the day, he called TJ, to have it realigned for a few bucks. We could use a trip, he said with glee. He even selected the friends he would like to take. In TJ, I'm sure that you go to look for used books because you're an asshole. The rest of us will go to a bordello. I know quite a few. It took us a week to rip out all the lining and sand the metal surface to prepare it for its new lining. Rodrigo had 2 weeks left to study then, and he still considered that to be too much time. He engaged me then in helping him paint his apartment and redo the floors. It took us over a week to paint it and sand the hardwood floors. He didn't want to point out the wallpaper in one room. He didn't want to paint out. We had to rent a machine that removed wallpaper by applying steam to it. Naturally, neither Rodrigo nor I knew how to use the machine properly, and we botched the job horrendously. We ended up having to use topping, a very fine mixture of plaster, of Paris and other substances that gives a wall a smooth surface. After all these endeavors, Rodrigo ended up having only 2 days left to cram 600 pages into his head. He went frantically into an all-day and all-night reading marathon with the help of amphetamines. Rodrigo did go to school the day of the exam and did sit down at his desk and did get the multiple choice exam sheet. What he didn't do was stay awake to take the exam. His body slumped forward and his head hit the desk with a terrifying thud. The exam had to be suspended for a while. The sociology teacher became hysterical, and so did the students sitting around Rodrigo. His body was stiff and icy cold. The whole class suspected the worst. They thought he had died of a heart attack. Paramedics were summoned to remove him. After a cursory examination, they pronounced Rodrigo profoundly asleep and took him to a hospital to sleep the effect of the amphetamines off. My projection into Rodrigo Cummings was so total that it frightened me. I was exactly like him. The similarity became untenable to me. In an act of what I considered to be total, suicidal nihilism, I rented a room in a dilapidated hotel in Hollywood. The carpets were green and had terrible cigarette burns that had obviously been snuffed out before they turned into full-fledged fires. It had green drapes and drab green walls. The blinking sign of the hotel shone all night through the window. I ended up doing exactly what Don Juan had requested, but in a roundabout way. I didn't do it to fulfill any of Don Juan's requirements or with the intention of patching up our differences. I did stay in that hotel room for months on end until my person, like Don Juan had proposed, died. Until it truthfully made no difference to me whether I had company or I was alone. After leaving the hotel, I went to live alone, closer to school. I continued my studies of anthropology, which had never been interrupted, and I started a very profitable business with a lady partner. Everything seemed perfectly in order until one day when the realization hit me like a kick in the head that I was going to spend the rest of my life worrying about my business, or worrying about the phantom choice between being an academic or a businessman, or worrying about my partner's foibles and shenanigans. True desperation pierced the depths of my being. For the first time in my life, despite all the things that I had done and seen, I had no way out. I was completely lost. I seriously began to toy with the idea of the most pragmatic and painless way to end my days. One morning, a loud and insistent knocking woke me up. I thought it was the landlady, and I was sure that if I didn't answer, she would enter with her passkey. I opened the door, and there was Don Juan. I was so surprised that I was numb. I stammered and stuttered, incapable of saying a word. I wanted to kiss his hand, to kneel in front of him. Don Juan came in and sat down with great ease on the edge of my bed. "I made the trip to Los Angeles," he said, "just to see you." I wanted to take him to breakfast, but he said that he had other things to attend to, and that he had only a moment to talk to me. I hurriedly told him about my experience in the hotel. His presence had created such havoc that not for a second did it occur to me to ask him how he had found out where I lived. I told Don Juan how intensely I regretted having said what I had in Hermosillo. You don't have to apologize, he assured me. Every one of us does the same thing. Once, I ran away from the sorcerer's world myself, and I had to nearly die to realize my stupidity. The important issue is to arrive at a breaking point in whatever way, and that's exactly what you have done. Inner silence is becoming real for you. This is the reason I am here in front of you, talking to you. Do you see what I mean? I thought I understood what he meant. I thought that he had intuited or read the way he'd read things in the air, that I was at my wit's end, and that he had to come to bail me out. You have no time to lose, he said. You must dissolve your business enterprise within an hour, because 1 hour is all I can afford to wait. Not because I don't want to wait, but because infinity is pressing me mercilessly. Let's say that infinity is giving you 1 hour to cancel yourself out. For infinity, the only worthwhile enterprise of a warrior is freedom. Any other enterprise is fraudulent. Can you dissolve everything in 1 hour? I didn't have to assure him that I could. I knew that I had to do it. Don Juan told me then that once I had succeeded in dissolving everything, he was going to wait for me at the marketplace in a town in Mexico. In my effort to think about the dissolution of my business, I overlooked what he was saying. He repeated it, and of course, I thought he was joking. How can I reach that town, Don Juan? Do you want me to drive? To take a plane? I asked. Dissolve your business first, he commanded. Then the solution will come. But remember, I'll be waiting for you. Only for an hour. He left the apartment, and I feverishly endeavored to dissolve everything I had. Naturally, it took me more than an hour, but I didn't stop to consider this, because once I had the dissolution of the business in motion, its momentum carried me. It was only when I was through that the real dilemma faced me. I knew then that I had failed hopelessly. I was left with no business and no possibilities of ever reaching Don Juan. I went to my bed and sought the only solace I could think of: quietude, silence. In order to facilitate the advent of inner silence, Don Juan had taught me a way to sit down on my bed, with the knees bent and the soles of the feet touching, the hands pushing the feet together by holding the ankles. He had given me a thick dowel that I always kept at hand whenever I went, wherever I went. It was cut to a 14-inch length to support the weight of my head if I leaned over, and put the dowel on the floor between my feet, and then placed the other end, which was cushioned, on the spot in the middle of my forehead. Every time I adopted this position, I fell sound asleep in a matter of seconds. I must have fallen asleep with my usual facility, for I dreamed that I was in the Mexican town where Don Juan had said he was going to meet me. I had always been intrigued by this town. The marketplace was open 1 day a week, and the farmers who lived in the area brought their products there to be sold. What fascinated me the most about that town was the paved road that led to it. At the very entrance to the town, it went over a steep hill. I had sat many times on a bench by a stand that sold cheese and had looked on that hill. I would see people who were coming into town with their donkeys and their loads. But I would see their heads first, and they kept approaching. As they kept approaching, I would see more of their bodies until the moment they were on the very top of the hill, when I would see their entire bodies. It seemed to me always that they were emerging from the earth, either slowly or very fast, depending on their speed. In my dream, Don Juan was waiting for me by the cheese stand. I approached him. "You made it from your inner silence," he said, patting me on the back. "You did reach your breaking point." For a moment, I had begun to lose hope, but I stuck around, knowing that you would make it. In that dream, we went for a stroll. I was happier than I had ever been. The dream was so vivid, so terrifyingly real, that it left me no doubts that I had resolved the problem, even if my resolving it was only a dream fantasy. Don Juan laughed, shaking his head. He had definitely read my thoughts. "You're not in a mere dream," he said. "But who am I to tell you that? You'll know it yourself someday, that there are no dreams from inner silence, because you'll choose to know it."